Let me greet you this morning, and we convene this joint meeting, colleagues of the Select Committee on Appropriations and the Select Committee on Finance, the Standing Committee on Appropriations and Standing Committee on Finance, in terms of our constitutional and legislative mandate to consider the fiscal framework, the Division of Revenue Bill, and the Appropriations Bill. Honorable members, Section 214 of the Constitution requires that the equitable division of nationally raised revenue amongst the three spheres of government must consider a range of constitutional principles, which include, of course, equity, developmental needs, the fiscal capacity. And in this regard, Section 220 and Section 222 of the Constitution establish the FFC as an independent advisory institution mandated to make recommendations to Parliament through these committees on matters concerning intergovernmental fiscal relations and the division of revenue. Furthermore, the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act of 2009, as amended, provides Parliamentary with an authority to consider and adopt the fiscal framework and to amend money bills within prescribed fiscal parameters. The Act also establishes the PBO, whose function is to provide independent, objective, and professional analysis to support Parliament and these committees in the exercise of this power. This joint engagement is therefore, colleagues, grounded in clear constitutional and statutory obligations. The FFC is required to submit recommendations of the Division of Revenue, while the PBO is mandated to provide analytical support to enable Parliament through these committees to interrogate macroeconomic assumptions, revenue projections, and expenditure allocations before adoption. As committees of the NCOP, we will therefore particularly, and we are concerned with the implications of the 2026 budget for provincial and local government finances, the integrity of the equitable share system, and the overall sustainability of the fiscal framework. Therefore, colleagues, as I officially open this meeting, we look forward to the evidence-based submissions that will assist Parliament in fulfilling its oversight and the legislative requirement. Thank you, colleagues. The meeting is officially opened, and I will immediately hand over to the PBO to give us their brief on the 2026 budget. Thank you and welcome once again. PBO.
Good morning, Honourable Chair, Honourable Members. Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Given the limited time and the amount of material we have to cover, I'll jump straight into the presentation. Can we move to next slide, please? Next. Just go to the introduction. We'll pass the outline. Okay, so the first page of the Budget Review of 2026 says that growth will be below levels needed to meaningfully reduce unemployment and generate sufficient revenue to expand social and economic services. This is an actual quote from page 1. We have to question the government's chosen definition of macro stability when we take into account the parlous levels of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, which are key macroeconomic variables, and the extremity indicates crisis levels of instability in the economy. So the budget review uses the language of stabilizing debt while choosing not to apply the word stabilizing to unemployment, poverty, and inequality indicators, and they recognize that their actions will not even come close to adequately addressing these within the medium-term framework. They mention measures such as not adjusting tax increases. Well, please move to the next slide, please. As supporting GDP growth, but their projections show low growth over the medium term. And I think that goes back to that warning that they gave us on page 1 of the budget review that low growth is not going to meaningfully reduce unemployment, generate sufficient revenue, and expand social and economic services. And at the same time, we expect GDP per capita growth to remain negative over the medium-term framework. So at the fiscal and structural reform level, when we consider the state of the world, we have to consider how we use the word stability and sustainably more carefully. Next slide, please. Mapula or Nelia, please carry on. Thank you.
Good morning, Honourable Chair and members. Some of the reforms to make government more efficient and cut wasteful programs and activities are the Targeted and Responsive Savings Initiative that has identified 12 billion in savings identified over the medium term from the audit of the social grants and the scaling down on the public transport network grant. A significant portion of these savings will be redirected towards PRASA, strengthening state capacity in the judiciary, border management, statistics, South Africa, and enhancing defence capabilities. Government is also taking steps to manage the wage bill. The 7,687 applications approved in the first phase of the early retirement program are expected to save 2.6 billion in 2026-27. Additional funds have been allocated to baselines for this purpose. The ghost worker audit has identified 4,323 suspicious cases in the personal system. Next slide. Members, this table shows some of the funding responses to SONA in terms of the economic development. Additional funds have been provided for science and technology, as well as for the National Roads function. The Industrial Development Corporation receives an additional 1.5 billion in 2026-7 for the social employment funds as part of the Presidential Employment Initiative. An increase of 16.5 billion has been included in the provincial equitable share for the health sector for building capacity by employing more doctors. The net increase over the medium term in the learning and culture function is mainly for expansion of the early childhood development conditional grants that receives additional funding of 11.9 billion over the medium term. Next slide. In the peace and security function, additional funds is provided to fight gang violence and to protect our borders. In general public service, the Public Service Commission receives an additional 109 million to expand their services to other spheres of government. The Social Relief of Distress grant has been extended until 31 March 2027, resulting in an increase of 36.4 billion in 26 to the grant. But it should be noted, members, that the growth and inclusion strategy of government identified that the redesign of the Social Relief of Distress grant should have been finalized by the department, the presidency and National Treasury before the tabling of the 26 budget. Next slide. The diagram shows that the biggest changes of the medium term is in social development, followed by community development, health, and then learning and culture. Next slide. This diagram shows budget allocations across the budget function groups as a proportion of total consolidated expenditure between 22 and 2028. So members, you will see the biggest proportion of the budget or the consolidated budget is spent on learning and culture, followed by social development and debt service costs, which is still rising over the medium term. Next slide. The medium-term development plan requires from the Presidency, the National Treasury, and the DTIC to develop and coordinate an integrated economic growth strategy, which resulted in the development of the Growth and Inclusive Strategy, or GAIN. This strategy aims to align initiatives across government and outlines a growth narrative for South Africa to address specific strategic interventions before the midterm target of the medium-term development plan. The strategy includes actions on several sectors as listed below, and the implementation plan with the due dates is allocated as an annexure to this presentation and should guide oversight initiatives. To ensure implementation, to ensure implementation. To note is that several due dates were already for December 2025. Thank you. Next presentation. Present.
Thank you very much, Nelia, Honourable Chair and Honourable Members. The global outlook of all the major organizations shown here, and we also show for South Africa for the Reserve Bank and National Treasury, seems to indicate that at a global level there would be sort of some resilience and growth. But what we're seeing, particularly in the last few days, is that global growth downside risks have escalated immensely. Even if the war ends soon, the outbreak of the war and the closing of the Hormuz Strait shows the important fact that much of our inflation is from external sources, and that a low inflation target is not going to increase confidence and anchor inflation expectations that keep interest rates at a lower level as hoped for, I think, in the budget review of 2026. It also shows us that fiscal policy to support macroeconomic stability has to support building resilience in society and not focus on a few select fiscal variables and ratios. Next slide, please. So we use the 2026 forecast in the we use the 2026 budget review forecast to do these calculations. And what we're seeing is a continued reliance and, or to some extent, disturbing reliance on an increase in household spending to support GDP growth when government is not going to be spending much to increase their contribution to GDP, and where inflation is still going to remain at these really low levels, much below probably half of the kind of investment levels as a percentage of GDP that most developing countries hope to achieve to actually show progress. So what we're seeing is sorry, I'm just losing my track of thought. Can we move on to the next slide, please? I'm sorry, just go back to the previous slide. I just want to make the point about investment. Sorry about that. So what we're also seeing is, even though the forecasts show really low levels of investment, the 2026 budget review once again overestimates investment, and they expect it to climb 4.4% from the -2% in 2025 to the forecast of 2.4% in 2026, and by 2028 they expect it to be 3.9%. And if we move on to the next slide, please. And what we did was we created this table to show what the forecasts were for 2024 real investment growth in different documents, the medium-term budget policy statements from 2021 through the budget review of 2024 and the medium-term budget policy statement of 2024. And we see the extent to which 2024 investment was overestimated. And we see it finally coming down by the medium-term budget statement of 2024, but this is I think a problem, and it seems to be a continuing problem. Next slide, please. So households, as a situation now, are not in a situation to keep pushing growth up. So even though we're seeing over the medium term and possibly longer that, you know, as household consumption is growing up to moving towards 70% of GDP, it seems that this is sort of what could be the driver of growth. But we're sitting in a situation that those with access to debt are unable to pay down their debt at a meaningful pace, but also income inequality of the bottom 50%, who actually, in terms of the wealth distribution, have negative wealth, basically debt, but get only 6% of income using the 2024 World Inequality Report figures, means that, you know, unless we see increased expenditure on allowing millions of households in South Africa more affordability and ability to increase the expenditure, we're not going to see a growth growing meaningfully beyond the levels, and that warning on page 1 will stay in place. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we've looked at investment and employment trends over long term, because there is this idea that investment is going to grow and that's going to contribute to GDP, and that's going to then cause South Africa's to have a better sentiment and lower interest rates and more collection of taxes. That's going to allow us then to lower the debt ratios and run budget surpluses. But I think it's important that we think through what the trends in investment are, and that these assumptions do not adequately take into account part dependence and the South African economic structure, which is around concentration, that constrains growth and employment creation. And so we've added some additional slides at the end, because we don't have time to go through all of them in detail, but we're seeing that the South African economy is very investments and employment are very much so in the tertiary sector, and much less over a long period of time in an economy that has been deindustrializing and has had less investment in productive industrial areas like manufacturing and productive services. And so the kind of services investment that we've been getting has been to support the kind of financial sectors, real estate activities, and those households that can afford to consume more, to afford to support their consumption, but also consumption of the little consumption by the millions of households that are having a hard time. Can we move on to slide 19, please? So what we're seeing is that much of the investment has been going to sectors that are related to household consumption and household spending. And I sometimes use the word consumption because that's the official term, but a lot of household spending is actually investment in members of the household, particularly for the poorer households, right? So but as I showed that households, whether they're middle class or whether they in the lower 50% or more of the South African income distribution, have got very little ability to support this kind of increase in household consumption that's been leading to growth. So we're seeing real limits then even in the way in which investment is directed in the economy to supporting growth, but also then supporting more reducing of unemployment, more jobs, and those kind of things. If we can move on to slide 20. Just to be quick, what I did with the slide is because a lot of the approach to growth and stabilizing debt is linked to this notion of sentiment, and I think one of the important gauges, not the only one, are sort of the credit ratings agencies, and overall we see the credit rating agencies adhere to the macroeconomic approach of government and support reducing government expenditure and the primary deficit and the debt ratio, and they see this as supporting sentiment. However, the credit rating agencies have continuously warned, when writing about South Africa and do their ratings, about extreme structural unemployment, poverty, and inequality, on the ability of government to keep servicing debt. I'm not going to go through all the examples of Standard & Poor's, but just to point out that Moody's actually in 2019 brought out a report on the extreme inequality, noted South Africa at the highest levels of inequality in the world. And they say one of the consequences of those structural problems, high structural unemployment and high level of poverty, is that in turn they fuel income inequality as well as reducing human capital and weakening the country's productive base. Next slide, please. So overall, I think it's important that we then reconsider this approach that is taken in by government and is present in the 2026 budget review, to think about sentiment and to realize that if we look at the global development economics literature and often macroeconomic literature that talks about sentiment, that they may have the causation between sentiment and growth reversed. And in fact, its success and the ability to deal with, successfully reform faster, to put growth measures in place, and to reduce unemployment, poverty, and inequality through growing employment, that actually leads to improved sentiment and drives further investment, and including foreign direct investment in your economy. So achieving much better performance and higher growth and forecast in 2026 budget review will go a long way to reducing government's debt and debt repayment ratios, improve sentiment, and reduce the cost of borrowing in the economy. Next slide, please. So the last two slides talk to the PBO's projections, where we modeled by basically updating the model with the most recent data in the 2026 budget review. And our projections show that the outlook for GDP growth of the medium term is significantly below the NDP target of 5.4% and the medium-term development policy target of GDP growth above 3%. The projections indicate that the 2026 budget doesn't generate the scale of economic expansion required to tackle the high levels of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, constraining aggregate demand growth in the economy. And aggregate demand growth is linked to household consumption, which is the major part and growing now towards 70% of GDP in its contribution. The South African economy remains extremely concentrated in terms of market share and wealth, with a high level of financialization and deindustrialization. So inclusive economic growth requires shifting away from fiscal consolidation towards targeted investments in infrastructure, public services, skills, and industrial policy. It also requires prioritizing resources towards poor households, townships, and rural economies. Such investments crowd in private sector activity by creating demand and reducing structural constraints. And as I was saying earlier, could lead to successes that improve sentiment, that further drive investment. The PBO's projections for unemployment, poverty, and inequality over the medium term show marginal progress. We see in these slides that poverty and inequality show a slight decline, but remains stubbornly high. Unemployment declines marginally, however, the pace is far too slow to meaningfully change South Africa's broader social and economic trajectory. The projected decline in social assistance spending as a share of GDP signals a fiscal disconnect where current budget allocations are not aligned with the developmental and redistributive goals of the MTDP. This suggests that government is likely to fall far short of achieving the key MTDP and NDP targets, particularly in addressing UPI, equitable growth, and human development. Can we move on to the next presenter, please? Thank you very much.
Good morning, honorable members. I'll be taking us through the fiscal framework. Next slide, please. On this slide, honorable members, what you'll see on the top left graph is basically the changes to the main budget revenue. What members will notice is that there's been downward revisions in the medium term. However, for the 2025-26 year, there's an upward revision in terms of revenue, which we'll discuss later as well. On the top right corner, members will see the main budget expenditure. Again, a similar trend, which is that there's been downward revisions in the medium term. However, there's an upward revision for 2025-26, which is the year, obviously, we are ending. In terms of the primary balance, and of course to remind members that the primary balance is total revenue minus non-interest expenditure. So here you'll see, members, that there's downward revisions in the medium term as well. And in terms of the main budget balance, as a percentage of GDP, this is upward revised for the medium term. Next slide, please. In this slide, honorable members, I think Suraj has spoken a lot to some of the things that I'm going to be covering here, but to basically say that the fiscal framework approach has fundamentally not changed. It's still structured around restoring debt sustainability through expenditure restraint, meaning fiscal consolidation. And the priority is to stabilize debt to GDP ratio. That is the primary goal of the fiscal framework as it currently stands. This is not to say that there isn't expenditure on social expenditure and so forth, but to say that the current goal is really to reduce debt to GDP or stabilize debt to GDP ratio. As Suraj already highlighted, government assumes that the credibility with financial markets is the main channel for growth. But as again, Suraj has already highlighted that it does not fundamentally take into account the structural issues that South Africa faces. The approach here is that if we reduce the risk premium through fiscal consolidation, we'll be able to crowd in investment. However, if we look at investment trends, we haven't been able to adequately crowd in investment, particularly from the private sector. To also highlight to members that as Treasury says that they'll be proposing a fiscal anchor, to remind members that we do have, in a way, a rules-based fiscal management philosophy that already exists. And we can see this in the baseline allocations, the expenditure ceilings, and even the division of revenue framework, in a way, is a rules-based fiscal management philosophy because it already separates the proportions of who gets how much. So the question really is, do we need to legislate a fiscal anchor when fiscal anchors, in a way, already exist in how the budget itself, when the budget process is undertaken on the National Treasury side. But most importantly, we believe that there's an underestimation of fiscal multipliers, particularly in our economy. So when we fiscally consolidate, have we adequately considered the fiscal multipliers and how reducing expenditure, or not reducing, but fiscally consolidating results in a ripple effect on the economy broadly. And lastly, to just say, just by stabilizing ratios, it doesn't mean that we'll be resolving the underlying developmental constraints. It is possible that we can get our ideal debt to GDP ratio. However, the structural inequalities in our economy will still persist. Next slide, please. In this slide, members, what we want to highlight is that Chapter 3 really frames social spending as a cost rather than a long-term investment in human capital, social cohesion, and household resilience. We've already highlighted this in the past to say that fiscal consolidation leads to downward pressure on social spending and real per capita service delivery. As members know, we always show the real per capita expenditure trends to demonstrate how sectors are actually particularly impacted in real terms when budgets are increased nominally, but they still result in real per capita declines. On the graphic there on the right, members, this is basically to show the critical feedback loop. So consolidation versus development in a low growth setting. As we know, South Africa is currently in a low growth setting. So here where the graphic begins is that we have fiscal consolidation, which leads to deteriorating services. And to point out to members that since 2015, general government economic infrastructure, public corporations economic infrastructure, and general government social infrastructure have been declining in real terms. So this is a real implication of fiscal consolidation, is that since 2015 in real terms, we have been underinvesting in infrastructure. What does this lead to? It leads to, a lack of service provisioning, and that leads to economic drag, where business costs rise. So businesses have to figure out, for example, the current water crisis. There's an article that was recently published about how businesses can secure their own water security given the current crisis that is happening. It also results in human capital stagnation and demands and weakens demand, which we've always highlighted that South Africa's got a demand problem, not only a supply side issue. This all leads to low economic growth. And as well, when you have low economic growth, you're going to have a lower tax revenue. And lastly, that just worsens your fiscal ratios because debt to GDP is a ratio, right? And GDP being the denominator. So when you've got a lower GDP, it obviously means that your debt to GDP ratio increases. And then what happens is countries will then engage in another fiscal consolidation process again to try and remedy the worsened debt to GDP ratios. And so you end up in a vicious cycle of a feedback loop in terms of fiscal consolidation. Next slide, please. In this slide, honorable members, what members might have seen is that there's been an upward revision in terms of the debt to GDP ratio as compared to the MTBPS. Initially, debt to GDP was supposed to be 77.9% in 2025-26. This has been revised upwards to 78.9%. But here, members, what we're trying to show you on the bottom left graph is to say that even though the minister says that debt will stabilize for the first time in 17 years, to show members that across different budgets, the debt to GDP ratios have been continuously upward revised. So in every budget, members will notice, and I went through all the budgets since 2012, that the word stabilize is used to say this is where the debt to GDP will peak. But in every budget since 2012, this number has been adjusted upwards. And so we'll have to wait for the MTBPS and next year's budget to really see if we've peaked or if this is just a continuous readjusting of the stabilization point. The bottom right graph shows debt to service costs as a share of revenue. And here, members, what I want to show you is that they're also expected to decline. Debt to service costs as share of revenue are expected to decline. However, I think this graph particularly shows us that we are not going to be increasing revenue enough, which is also connected to growth. And so that is why in the outer years, you still have a high debt to service costs as a share of revenue. So to connect revenue, debt, and GDP all together in this one graph. Next slide, please. Here, honorable members, what we're showing you, as we always show you, is the real per capita allocated by function to basically say in the last year or the current year that we're in, 2025-26, the real per capita expenditure has been revised downward. This is obviously because when we take into account inflation and population growth, even though the medium-term budget is nominally growing at 3.7%, when you take into account the 3.3% average inflation, plus the 1.23% population growth, what you fundamentally get is that in real per capita terms, then our budgets are not growing as are perceived through the nominal numbers in the budget. We also highlight that we must continuously be thinking about how current allocations are addressing the significant backlogs in the provision of basic service, public services, as observed again by the current water crises that are occurring in South Africa. But also, as one of the honorable members had highlighted, we still have significant backlogs in disaster management, particularly damages to infrastructure that is still not being addressed in the long term. Next slide, please. In this slide, honorable members, you will note that in the last presentation, I said that in the 2025 MTBPS, we were not provided with the social wage table as usual, but in this budget, the social wage table is back, and to basically say that the real per capita expenditure in 2026 was initially estimated to be 20,223, which means that we'll be spending 20,223 per person in South African real terms. It is now expected to be 20,169, which is a decline in real per capita terms in terms of what National Treasury defines as the social wage. But also here to also say to members that if members look at the budget from last year versus the budget from this year, the social wage category, which was initially employment programs, has now been changed to public works and community works programs. So there's a slight wording change between the budgets when you compare them. Next slide, please. In this slide, honorable members, as you will know, is that the gross tax revenue is revised upwards from the 2025 budget by 21.3 billion. As everyone has already noticed or knows, there are inflationary adjustments to the tax brackets as well as medical aid credits for the first time in 2 years. We believe that, of course, as we've said, even in the past, that there should be adjustments to the personal income tax brackets, as those, particularly in the low brackets, are disproportionately impacted. So we welcome this positive development. However, we also want to highlight that the other tax changes, when you take into account medical aid credits, tax-free savings, the retirement contributions, and the single discretionary allowance disproportionately benefit those with higher incomes. Just to note, members, the single discretionary allowance has been increased from 1 million to 2 million. And what does that mean? It means that you can essentially offshore 2 million rand in South Africa as a single once-off discretionary allowance. And also, as members would have noticed, there's been tax thresholds and limits have been adjusted, which is a positive development as well. As members will notice, some of these tax changes haven't been undertaken in over a decade. So this is a positive development in terms of thinking about how to progressively be thinking about the tax system and changes over time. Next slide, please. In this slide, honorable members, we highlighted in the pre-briefing how global minimum tax was still a question. And fortunately, I think Treasury might have heard our whispers because they've provided us with numbers to basically say that what they expect to get from implementing the GloBE tax rules is 2 billion in 2026-27. Members might recall, those who are still here back then, that the initial estimation was 8 billion. So I think there's a question there about projections and how this number 8 billion, and we'd asked this in the past, how did the National Treasury come to the number 8 billion? And we can see now that we've gotten significantly lower. And I won't go through each one of these, but to basically say to members, the carbon tax is going ahead. As I indicated in the pre-briefing, there was a question about whether it will be extended again. And of course, excise duties, we're still talking about the taxation or the amendments later in the year as well. And I think lastly to say that what is interesting is in terms of the special economic zones is this idea that, profit shifting is occurring. You usually see this at an international scale, which is why the globe rules were created. But what I think National Treasury has noticed and which is actually important to address is this question of what happens when people take advantage of special taxation rules within a special economic in a special economic zone. Next slide, please. I'll take broadly this slide as read, and as we've circulated in our fiscal anchors paper, as part of our pre-briefings for this budget, we spoke about how, fiscal policy should be developmental, and so we need to think about fiscal anchors, if we are to consider them, how they may hinder this developmental role of the fiscal framework and the budget itself broadly, to really think about debt sustainability, which needs to be anchored within a broader strategy of structural transformation, human capital creation, sustainable growth, and employment creation, which has already been covered. And also we need a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So we really need to consider what our strategy is, because as Siraj already noted, with the current strategy, we're not even getting the growth that we had anticipated. I'll hand over to my next colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Busi. Next slide, slide 35, please. Members, the table shows the changes to the total expenditure for selection of national votes between the revised 2025 and the 2026 financial years. You will see in terms of the growth rates between the 2 years, the 11.9% increase for the Public Service Commission is mainly for compensation of employees. The 75% increase for traditional affairs is providing for infrastructure for the royal houses. And then the 65.4% increase in women, youth, and persons with disabilities provides for the National Youth Development Agency. The reduction in 26-27 in communications and digital technologies is due to the once-off adjustments made for the rollout of the South African Connect project and the special appropriations for Centec in 2025-26. And then there was also a reduction in human settlements, which is due to the restructuring of the conditional grants. Next slide. This table shows the personnel numbers and unit cost for selection of votes in 2025 and 2026. To note are the difference between the number of the funded posts and the 2026-27 numbers. For example, members, when you look at the Home Affairs line, the number of funded positions are 7,275, while the appointments in 2026 reflects a number of 11,933, which is 4,658 more than the number of funded positions. Another one example is in terms of justice and constitutional development. There's a difference of 1,020 between the funded and the current staff component, but you will also see some of those numbers are reflected in the number of posts additional to the establishment. In water and sanitation, there's the number of funded positions that are reflected in the estimates of national expenditure is 4,875, but the number that they estimate they're going to employ in 26-27 is 2,680, which is 2,195 less. Next slide. Transfers from national votes to provinces and municipalities in the form of conditional grants. I've highlighted corporate governance in red in that line. That is fairly new grant that started in 2024-25, which is provincial disaster. It's a provincial disaster response grant that provides for immediate financial response in the case of a disaster. In human settlements development, you can see there's a reduction over the medium term. And as I mentioned, it is because of the review of the, and to improve the conditional grants. The transfers to municipalities, to note, is the high increase in the National Treasury that transfer funds to municipalities. The National Treasury grants are for capacity building, the smart meters and urban development financing, and neighborhood development partnership grant. In transport, you can see over the medium term the reduction in the transport, and we've also mentioned that the 8.3 billion is in the public transport network grant over the medium term. Next slide. Members, functional spending as a percentage of GDP shows the function's relative size in the economy. Government expenditure affects GDP differently, depending on which function the money is spent on. The impact depends on how each type of spending influences consumption, investment, productivity, and long-term growth, which are indicated on the legend on the right-hand side of the graph. And the diagram also shows the outcomes and estimates of functional spending as a percentage of GDP over the period. Thank you. Next presenter.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take you through the next set of slides. Next slide, please. In this slide, we just provide an update on the contingent liabilities as well as the guarantee portfolio. Generally, it has increased by 147.9 billion. Exposure increased by 10.3 billion. Additional support is mainly with regard to Transnet, which has made some drawdowns, mainly for debt redemptions as well as liquidity management, as well as some critical capital investment. Triple P's country liability is quite limited, the 3.3 billion, but commitments to independent power producers, it rose to 303 billion. Next slide, please. In this next slide, we just provide another update on selected SOEs and public entities. With Eskom, we saw that in 2024-2025, it made some profits. Load shedding also declined. However, municipal areas owed to Eskom increased by 20.2 billion to 94.8 billion due to low payment levels by municipalities. We're also seeing challenges with Eskom in the fact that the tariff that it receives is not adequate to fully cover the cost. So the long-term, financial sustainability for Eskom depends on this tariff adjustment according to them, as well as recovery of the municipal debt. With regards to Transnet, like I indicated, it's facing some tough challenges, but the additional 145 billion is going to help it to support some of its critical capital investment. However, financial recovery of Transnet again depends on operational reform that the government is implementing improved corridor performance as well as increased private sector participation. With regard to the passenger rail, it received 23.1 billion to upgrade signal and telecommunications. There was also an additional 5.8 billion for rolling stock renewal. As well, the entity also plans to increase passenger numbers from 77 million to 250, or between 250 and 450 million over the medium term. Ongoing infrastructure vandalism, security costs are also continuing to affect service delivery with regards to that. But what we've seen from international experience is that, some countries like China and South Korea, they were there at a time where they supported strategic infrastructure and state enterprises through performance-linked financing and coordinated industrial policy, which led to competitive. This is what some of the proper things that the national government is trying to do. So what is critical there is to ensure that they actually deliver on those ones. Next slide, please. On this slide, we just show the public sector infrastructure expend that the minister announced that over the medium term is going to increase. It's going to be over at least 1 trillion. Most of the funding is pulled from budget allocations on revenue as well as private investors. Transport and energy account for 60% of total infrastructure over the period, and then more than half of it is implemented through public entities and state-owned entities, just as I've given more details on Transnet and Eskom and the likes. Water and sanitation investment are also going to be implemented through the medium term. Next slide, please. On this next slide. On this slide, we just talk about private sector participation and blended finance. You had Professor Mohamed indicated this is an assumption that the private sector is going to come to the party. They're going to invest a lot in the country if certain conditions are met. Even the IMF report says that the 2026 budget also places emphasis on increasing private sector participation in infrastructure delivery. These reforms, government reforms, are meant to crowd in private investment as well as to reduce the pressure on the public purse. Triple regulations have been simplified, and as well as municipal triple regulations are set to be published later this year. A formal framework for unsolicited private sector proposal was introduced last year. The IFISA is also going to come operational by this year in March or end of April. So basically, the government is trying to use blended finance, which combines funds from from the budget itself, from SOE borrowing, as well as from development institutions to try to drive the infrastructure reforms. The advantage of this is that it can indeed accelerate infrastructure if it's implemented properly, as well as not all the funding pressures is going to be on government, and then government then tends to share construction and operational risk, and as well as technical expertise with professionals. It can also help to mobilize long-term capital. But however, the risk that might materialize is that private costs are higher, are more higher, and as well as revenue and demand guarantees can always, most of the time, they shift back to government. That is what we indicated earlier on. Off balance sheet exposure also may understate long-term fiscal risk. But private participation is quite limited in South Africa, and there's a need for it to improve. Next slide, please. Quickly. So basically, this is just a summary of the infrastructure section. That guarantee exposure is still concentrated in those critical energy and logistic, and then they are linked to the financial risk of the country. It means if Eskom and Transnet do not work, the contingent liability might materialize and put more risk to the government. So there's a need to ensure that allocations towards those two entities are spent properly, and then we get value for money. Next slide, please. I'm going to then move on to the special appropriation bill. The special appropriation bill is for expenditure that was announced in the 2025 medium-term budget policy, as well as additional pressures. The focus is mainly on infrastructure delivery. The next slide. This table just shows that same information I was talking about, that capital investment through Transnet, rebuilding of Parliament, capitalization of the credit guarantee scheme, Centec dual elimination costs, as well as funding the municipal elections that are going to come later on this year. I've already talked about the PRASA, as well as the work that is being done at the Durban Container Terminal that owed to Centec by SABC, as well as share subscription to International Finance Corporation. The government paid 1 billion to the private sector component of the World Bank, the IFC, which will then help the country in moving towards getting the private sector to participate more in the economy, in infrastructure delivery. The main focus, like I indicated, is on economic infrastructure. Funding 69% goes to rail, port, and freight corridor upgrades, financial investment and guarantees, as well as ICT and digital upgrades. Next slide, please. The next slide just shows generally the same information that we talked about. The key takeaway is that there are risks. The risks are with regards to weak implementation capacity, delivery delays, rising contingent liabilities from guarantees. So these are some of the main challenges that we've seen. Government has been having challenges with with delivering infrastructure due to a number of issues. So it's important that those risks are looked into. Oversight is the key to ensure that the finance committee, as well as other portfolio committees looking after respective budget allocation, should ensure that they provide the required oversight to ensure success in those type of projects. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm just going to run through the slides on local government finance reform, and just to provide an update on a few issues. Next slide. In this one here, we see that after providing for debt service costs, the minister did say local government then receives 9.5% of national revenue. Those are the figures. The equitable share, they use it, municipalities, local government uses to fund basic services and operational support, whereas control grants are used to fund infrastructure, public transport, water services. But as we've seen in the news, recent news, this is not actually happening on the ground. So over the MTF transfers to our local government only grows at an average of 3.1%, which is a bit low. So according to National Treasury, they believe that this framework remains redistributive in that rural municipalities are more dependent on transfers, whereas metros, they depend on revenue. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen in local government to ensure that actual funding that's put in place actually results in credible infrastructure. Next slide, please. On the next slide, yeah, we talk about the conditional grants. My colleague has already talked about transfers to municipality. So key grants such as MIG, Urban Development Finance, Informal Settlement grants, that is the allocation that they get over the MTF. And then infrastructure grants, they remain a critical component of transfers. Spending obviously varies according to different municipalities, where poor or rural municipalities they always have issues with spending due to procurement delays, weak project preparation, which leads to some projects not delivered, or some projects delivered at a poor quality, which does not help this service delivery or the community. Next slide, please. On this next slide, we show that generally municipalities are under distress. There's debt, there's compliance issue. 63% of municipalities, they face financial distress. 88 have unfunded budget. It means that they are implementing projects without any funding. They're limiting infrastructure maintenance service and maintenance and service sustainability. We see that within local government, there's limited private participation, to fund basic infrastructure that is needed within the local spheres of government. Municipal areas have talked to that, but the main reason is because some municipalities, they've got weak revenue collection, they've got a number of electricity losses, as well as consumer non-payment. That is a key issue. So that is why you would see that the government has allocated some money towards smart meters to try to deal with the issue of billing. We also see that own revenues remains concentrated in bigger municipalities, as well as municipalities. Weak audit outcomes, rising personnel costs, governance instability, some of the issues that we are facing within local government. We saw that debt to water bill stands at 24.5 billion, which is also a concern. There have been a number of municipalities who have been breaching the MFMA. National Treasury decided to hold transfers to those ones, 75 of those municipalities. Obviously, when they hold the transfers, it means the people or the communities within those municipalities, they are going to suffer even further. It means that whatever they were getting, they're not going to get. It means most of this municipality, they breach MFMA because they don't have enough funding to be able to deliver basic services. So that is also a cause of concern, something to look out for. UFRW, which is irregular, unauthorized, irregular, and fruitless and wasteful expenditure also increased to 263.3 billion in 2023 financial year. So there's a number of issues that need to be addressed within the local government spheres. Next slide, please. Quickly in closing. So essentially, there's currently a local government white paper, as well as local government fiscal framework that is being reviewed to achieve some of the to address some of the challenges that are highlighted. So it is up to this committee and other committees. So when the National Treasury and Cooperative Governance come and present the reviewed a white paper in time, as well as the fiscal framework, to ask whether it's going to answer some of the questions or some of the risks that are highlighted. If those reviews does not actually answer those, then what would be the point? So it's imperative that whatever review comes out of all this process, they're able to address some of the challenges that we are seeing within municipalities. Some of them I've highlighted them there, but because of time, I won't go through them. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, for your indulgence and allowing us to go over time. In fairness to our FFC colleagues, I'm not going to repeat the points we make in the conclusion. I think it's prudent that we just end there. And thank you again to members, and we apologize for going over time.
Thank you very much, Siraj and the team, for your insightful presentations. I'm now going to give this opportunity to FFC, led by Dr. Mbava, to give us their analysis on the 2026 budget. Dr. Mbava, you can take the committee through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. Good morning to yourself and good morning to all the honorable members and other stakeholders. If I can just have the presentation flighted by FFC.
Good morning, Chairperson and honourable members. Can I please request, oh, there we go. Thank you so much. I'm going to share now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In terms of our presentation, Chairperson, if you can just go, Gianni, to slide 2. Yes, the outline. Yes, thank you so much. In terms of our presentation, we are going to cover the role of the FFC in the budget process, the macroeconomic landscape and fiscal strategy as we understand it, the appropriation bill, the division of revenue for provinces and local government, and then we'll have our recommendations. The next slide, please. In terms of our mandate, we are a Chapter 13 institution in the Constitution, and our core function is to provide independent research and recommendations to Parliament, the legislatures, and other state organs on financial and fiscal matters. In this instance, we are providing our recommendations on Budget 2026. The next slide. There are specific legislative prescripts which can only be enacted when the recommendations of the FFC are considered. These are listed here, Section 214, 218, and other legislation. Next slide. In terms of our analysis, Chairperson and members, we are going to give an in-depth analysis on the revenue laws and tax proposals, the overall fiscal framework, division of revenue, appropriation bill. This is to ensure that fiscal policy remains aligned with the country's broader economic goals and constitutional obligations. We are also mandated through the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act to also provide our recommendations on Budget 2026. Next slide. Our recommendations are framed through the Constitution, where we look at various matters, including the fiscal capacities of the provinces. We look at disparities within the provinces and other matters as well to ensure that our recommendations support the constitutional mandate. The next slide. The recommendations of the Fiscal Commission are integrated into South Africa's annual fiscal cycle. Currently, we are in March, therefore we are looking at the budget as well as the SONA. And in the next few months, we will also be submitting our annual submission for the next financial year. The next slide. In terms of our criteria, we use various criteria when we look at the recommendations. The important thing to note, members, is that the Constitution mandates that parliamentary committees seek the FFC's recommendations to ensure that the budget decisions are informed by independent expert analysis rather than political considerations alone. This process ensures that the fiscal framework evolves to meet emerging challenges ranging from economic volatility to the impacts of climate change on municipal revenues. I'm now going to hand over to the head of research to take us through the technical analysis, starting with the landscape on fiscal strategy. Over to you, Chen.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Honourable Chair and members. First and foremost, the Financial and Fiscal Commission expresses our appreciation to the Honourable Minister of Finance for adopting and, more importantly, implementing the Commission's recommendations in Budget 2026, this budget, with its accompanying fiscal framework. The direct consultations between the Minister and the Commission over the past year have borne tangible results, as will be shown in this budget. These steps mark an important beginning in restoring fiscal credibility The responsibility now is to sustain this fiscal trajectory through continued expenditure containment, improved public sector efficiency, and decisive elimination of wasteful and fruitless expenditure, as well as corruption. Two key messages arise from the Commission submission on this budget, Honourable Chair members. First, although inflation has declined, contributing to an improved financial conditions, including moderating interest rates, a strengthening currency, and a reduced risk premium on South African debt. These developments should not be misconstrued, however, or overstated as evidence of substantive economic reform or robust growth. Unfortunately, our real GDP growth, as we keep on reminding ourselves and checking ourselves, in the third quarter of 2025 was only 0.5% annualized, while nominal GDP growth was 2.3%. These data points strongly suggest that the economy is exhibiting features of stagflation, characterized by stagnant growth. Accordingly, inflation, even if numerically low, as we've seen, under 4% or so, should still, therefore, be regarded as elevated in the current context. How does an economy arrive at the stage of stagflation, you may ask? It arises after years of wasteful fiscal expansions and fruitless borrowing directed towards unproductive expenditure, resulting in escalating debt servicing costs that generate no economic returns and consequently, of course, lead to a stagnant economy. Second, regarding the divisional revenue, the provincialization of the intergovernmental fiscal relations system within the 2026 MTF in this budget is duly noted. Provinces have, in this budget and in this divisional revenue bill, have received the largest share increase in the 2026 divisional revenue. The PES, provincial equitable share, for all 9 provinces increased by more than 1 percentage point above the inflation of the MTEF. In this context, therefore, the Commission would like to reiterate and call upon the imperative contained in Section 154, subsection 1 of the Constitution, where it says, and I read, the national and provincial government must, by legislative and other measures, support and strengthen the capacity of municipalities to manage their own affairs, exercise their powers, and perform their functions. I think that is a very important reminder, Honourable Chair members. I hope you would agree as we go into this year with this budget towards the local government election. Thank you very much. I hand over to Johnny and the team to take you over the presentation.
Thank you very much, Chen, and good morning again to all the honourable members and honourable chairperson. I'm going to take you through the macroeconomic outlook, as our head of research mentioned. Here we note minimizing price increases and maintaining price stability is essential to keeping goods and services affordable, as we know, as it protects purchasing power and helps to create an enabling environment for economic growth to flourish and be inclusive. As our head of research noted, we have achieved lower inflation in recent years, and this is what has created a large portion of the more favorable macroeconomic outlook in the budget. However, the Commission's empirical analysis demonstrated here on the figure, which shows nominal GDP and real GDP growth alongside headline inflation, we see a divergence between real and nominal economic growth in the third quarter of 2025, correlating with a slight uptick in inflation. And what this suggests, honourable members, is that growth was largely driven by price increases rather than actual increases in economic production. Therefore, the Commission maintains that the domestic growth outlook should be met with caution, especially given that real growth remains subdued below 1% at the moment. Further to this, analyzing key factors of production, namely, as shown in the slide here, employment, capital, and total factor productivity, reveals that the underlying productivity in the economy does remain low and below what is needed to strengthen the economic performance and the growth outlook. In addition, the empirical results provide evidence of persistently near zero levels of capital stock as a contribution to real growth in the economy. And the Commission reiterates that this requires attention in terms of maintaining neglected infrastructure. Moving to employment and growth considerations, the Commission reiterates its previous stance regarding the structure of the South African economy, which is dominated by the services sector, most notably financial services, in terms of its contribution to GDP, and that employment in the community and services sector, on the other hand, has not been met with proportional increases in GDP, suggesting this, what we call a relatively inelastic relationship. Importantly, from this slide, honourable members, more labour-intensive sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing have not grown in their shares of GDP, even with the updated data. And the Commission emphasises in this regard the need for more targeted policy shifts towards increasing production in these sectors, not only to strengthen industry, but also to strengthen the labour absorption capacity of the economy to address persistent structural widespread unemployment. Turning to the macroeconomic forecasts, we know the Treasury estimates that the economy will grow at 1.6% in 2026 and climb to 2.2% in 2028. The Commission's growth forecast, on the other hand, which is presented here in the figure, estimates real GDP growth to trend downwards over the medium term, potentially downwards, which provides a less optimistic growth outlook. So the Commission remains cautious because there are the growth, estimated growth is below the threshold of meaningfully tackling unemployment and expanding the tax base in South Africa. And we note that reversing this potential downward trend will require eliminating redundancies in fiscal spending, reallocating existing spending towards more productive investments, and importantly, reallocations need to be strategic and not duplicative in nature. Then, honourable members, to the fiscal policy outlook, the 2026 budget expects a declining budget deficit over the medium term, along with the debt to GDP ratio stabilising. However, the Commission notes that debt service costs, importantly a direct charge on the National Revenue Fund, continue to increase nominally from 420.6 billion last year to 469.3 billion in 2028-29, thereby directly reducing the fiscal envelope in South Africa. Furthermore, as we see on this slide, the analysis on debt redemption shown in this figure shows that South Africa's, for the current 2026-27 financial year, total maturing debt amounts to 131.4 billion, or this translates into 6.3% of total revenue. And what is notable is that although debt redemptions are subject to renegotiation, as it currently stands, they're expected to increase to 274.2 billion, or 13.2% of revenue in 2027-28. So servicing public debt remains a significant challenge to restoring fiscal credibility in South Africa and continue to be a risk which needs to be properly managed to prevent a debt spiral or liquidity challenges. Honourable members, briefly to highlight some of the tax proposals, the adjustments, as was mentioned by our colleagues in the PBO, to the personal income tax brackets and rebates to account for inflation. This provides a degree of relief to household budgets as it minimises bracket creep. The budget also seeks to assist small businesses and encourage savings, also through adjusting the tax thresholds and limits for the impact of inflation. Savings is also further encouraged for individuals as well through the tax-free savings investment and increasing that annual limit. And on the other hand, we do note that, as we know, there's upward adjustments to the fuel levy and excise duties, which are expected. And then finally, from my side, honourable members, we turn to the revenue trends and the proposed fiscal paths shown in the figure. The figure here illustrates two scenarios for fiscal consolidation, either over a 5-year period or a 3-year period. And this is anchored on projected revenue streams and designed to achieve a balanced main budget position. So honourable members, just to illustrate here, the short-term fiscal consolidation path is very stringent, and this is shown in the red line on the figure. And it requires capping expenditure growth at a very low rate of 0.7% for a period of 3 years in order to achieve a balanced budget by 2028-29. But alternatively, the Commission also calculates a more medium-term fiscal consolidation path, which is shown in the green line, where expenditure growth remains capped at 3.1% per year over the 5-year period until 2031. And then you see that both of these lines increase after a balanced budget is achieved. So you can see that both the red and green increase, showing that expenditure growth increases then in line with revenue growth. Finally, the Commission does recognise the potential of the TARS initiative underway to identify savings nodes and eliminate unproductive spending. And the Commission urges it be used effectively. Thank you, honourable members. I'll hand over to my colleague, Neo, to take you through the section on government guarantees and recommendations pertaining to the fiscal framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. Honorable members and Chair, I'll take you through the section on contingent liabilities and government guarantees. So on this slide, basically, we provide an overview of contingent liabilities for the fiscal year 2025-26 and 2026-27. We note that the total government contingent liabilities are projected to increase to over 1.2 trillion in 2026-27, reflecting a 16.2 billion increase from 2025-26. Moreover, the increase in these liabilities is mainly driven by guarantees to Transnet, which will be increasing from 78 billion in 2025-26 to 137 billion in 26-27. It is also important that we highlight that a bulk of government guarantees exposure continue to be concentrated in three key areas, as our colleague from PBO also spoken about it, which includes Eskom, independent power producers, and Transnet. Together, these entities represent about 54.9% of total guarantees. We also see that other contingent liabilities which are not classified under direct guarantees are expected to rise from 496.1 billion to 519.6 billion in 2026-27. Within this category, we see that the road accident fund remains the largest component, accounting for about 29.9% of total contingent liabilities. And we also see that other notable liabilities include post-retirement medical assistant at 7.1% and claims against government departments, which remain stable at 3.3%. Next slide, Gianni, please. On this slide, we look at exposures and guarantees. So here we provide a comparison of exposure and guarantees across select entities, offering insight into the shifts in guarantees and guarantee exposure between 2025-26 and 2026-27 fiscal year. So firstly, we highlight the total guarantee exposure to these select entities increased by 21.7 billion from 2025-26 driven mainly by the significant increase in exposure to Transnet and independent power producers. By contrast, we see that also exposure to Eskom has declined following the implementation of government debt relief arrangement. However, as a commission, we continue to emphasize the imperative of addressing the financial and operational challenges confronting these SOEs in order to eradicate their sustained fiscal dependency. So delving deeper into these entities, we highlight that Transnet remains, in financial distress, as we have seen, and this has necessitated the urgent implementation of recovery and reform measures to strengthen and restore its financial position. So for 2026-27, we note that the total guarantee amount to Transnet is expected to increase by 86.2 billion due to the additional guarantees of 145.8 billion issued to the entity over the medium term to address potential funding shortfalls, liquidity pressures, and debt redemptions. Moreover, we see that guarantee exposure to Transnet in the fiscal year 25-26 increased by 28.1 billion, and this partly reflected a net drawdown of 34.2 billion on the entity's guarantee. Therefore, the Commission acknowledges the government's effort to support the restoration of Transnet's financial health. However, it remains concerned that the entity's continued reliance on public funds is likely to elevate fiscal risks and weaken accountability within the entity. Moving to independent power producers, we see that sorry, Gigi. Okay, sorry about that. Moving to independent power producers, we see that there is an increase of 31.4 billion in guarantee exposure in 2025-26, with a projected increase, however, of 17.2 billion in the guarantee amount in 2026-27. And this reflects the government's commitment to the renewable energy independent power producer procurement program. The reduction of 1 billion in guarantee exposure to public-private partnerships, we note that is mainly from the early termination of contracts. However, the Commission cautions that the reduction in that particular guarantee exposure, which is largely driven by the early termination of contracts, signifies persistent weaknesses in project sustainability and governance of IPPs and under the public-private partnership framework. Moving to the recommendations. So overall, the Commission makes the following recommendations with respect to the 2026 fiscal framework and strategy. So firstly, the Commission emphasizes that present relative economic stability presents a pivotal opportunity to strengthen fiscal management and recommends that the government utilize the opportunity to improve that management and restore fiscal discipline by committing to a fiscal consolidatory path, which should be anchored by a balanced budget target consistent with the Commission's proposal. Secondly, the Commission recommends that fiscal expenditure be aligned with actual inflation and revenue trends, which alongside targeted institutional realignments to improve public sector productivity. Thirdly, the Commission urges that wasteful and unproductive expenditure and duplicative functions be eliminated and recommends that the targeted responsible savings initiative be fast-tracked and monitored to ensure it is effectively implemented. Lastly, the Commission is of the view that alongside eliminating wasteful expenditure and also focusing on fiscal consolidation, that policy be focused towards strengthening long-term industrial development for employment creation. With your permission, Chair, I will hand over to my colleague Fabrice to go through the appropriation bill. Thank you.
Thanks, Nell, and good morning, Chairperson, honorable members, and colleagues on the platform. So I'll take you through the FFC's analysis of the 2026 appropriation bill, as well as the special appropriation bill. Next slide, please. On this slide, it just shows a high-level representation of some of the votes. So what we'd like to highlight to members here is that the budget reflects a government that remains committed to a redistributive social wage while operating within a tight fiscal constraints. As you'll see from the table on the screen, the social development votes account for approximately 25% of the total appropriation. reaffirming government's redistributive stance. Cooperative governance vote follows at 11.2%. By contrast, the votes for economic and productive sectors, such as the trade, industry and competition, agriculture, science and innovation, and small business development, receive less than 1% of the total allocation. What we'd like members to keep in mind here is that while social spending protects households, economic growth ultimately finances social protection. Therefore, members should reflect on whether the balance between redistribution and growth is sustainable over the long term and will help achieve the country's medium and long-term economic growth targets. The next few slides will unpack the analysis on the 2026 appropriation bill. Now here what we did is we looked at the percentage difference between the allocations in the 2026 appropriation bill relative to the 2025 budget for the 2026-27 financial year. This allows us to assess the budget responsiveness and consistency. And for clarity, the budget 2025 allocations for the 2026-27 financial year were treated as the baseline. So looking at the education, health, and social development votes, firstly on basic education, it receives a 5.2% increase for 2026-27 compared to budget 2025 baseline. And this follows marginal overspending of 0.9% in 2024-25. With basic education, the focus remains on strengthening early childhood development with an additional 12.8 billion allocated over the next 3 years. However, the Commission does want to express concern about the poor quality of basic education in South Africa, as reflected by the poor outcomes when it comes to reading for meaning amongst primary school learners. So as such, the Commission supports the department's efforts to roll out the mother tongue-based bilingual education strategy up to grade 7 over the MTEF period. And this is supported by an allocation of 95 million over the next 3 years in the curriculum policy support and monitoring program. With regards to higher education, we see that it's been adjusted down by 0.5% for 26-27 relative to the baseline in budget 2025. And this is in line with 0.3% underspending. Now, members, what we'd like to highlight here is that NSFAS receives 54.3 million to help cover just over 744,000 students. But this allocation is down from 58.1 billion that was outlined in budget 2025 for the 26-27 financial year. And this raises concerns with regards to access. At the same time, the Minister of Finance did acknowledge that the sector education and training authorities, as well as the National Skills Fund, has not yielded the expected outcomes. And in response to this, National Treasury has commissioned the Government Technical Advisory Center to conduct a comprehensive review of the national skills ecosystem in the year ahead. Now, this actually aligns with the Commission's own view for the need for a comprehensive review of all the sector education and training authorities. With regards to health, the allocation remains largely unchanged at 66.9 billion relative to its baseline, consistent with some minor underspending. Here, additional resources amounting to 21.3 billion over the medium term are directed towards doctor compensation and service shortfalls, which the Commission welcomes. However, we'd like to highlight here to honorable members is that it would have been good to see some targeted allocation towards South Africa's growing burden of non-communicable diseases, which remains a leading cause of death in the country. Moving on to the economic development votes. Here we see that agriculture, rural development, and land reform votes combined received a minor 0.1% increase for 26-27 compared to what was outlined in budget 2025 for the same financial year. Now, this follows underspending of 4% in the 24-25 financial year. National Treasury has announced that it is working with the Department of Agriculture to redirect approximately 400 million from underspent agricultural grants to help combat the foot and mouth disease. The combined votes for the mineral resources and energy, here we see a decline of 8.5%, despite prior overspending, which reveals a clear budgetary inconsistency. Despite this, several strategic developments are underway, including shale gas research, the Junior Mining Exploration Fund, and the electricity market reform. Now, the Commission does welcome these efforts as they are crucial to stimulating investment and economic growth. However, it underscores the need for more consistent and realistic funded planning. With regards to trade, industry, and competition, receives a 14.3% increase for 26-27 relative to the baseline, despite some underspending of 3.3% in 24-25, and this is allocation for 26-27 is largely due to the extension of the Presidential Employment Initiative and the Social Employment Fund. With regards to transport, here we see a 5.9% increase, and that's consistent with 5.4% overspending that occurred in 24-25. And here the major allocation goes towards PRASA for signaling upgrades and for the improvement of rail operations, which is in line with the Commission's prior recommendations on the need to modernize rail systems. On the next slide, we show some of the peace and security votes. So firstly, with regards to defense, it experiences a 1.6% decrease for 26-27 relative to the baseline, despite the 12% overspending that occurred in 24-25. Now, this suggests structural underfunding combined with operational demands that are exceeding budget realities. Over the medium term, an additional 2.7 billion has been allocated, including 857 million in 2026-27. And these funds are directed towards maintaining core operational capabilities and supporting critical readiness requirements. Furthermore, 1 billion has been channeled through the criminal assets recovery account to help support efforts to combat organized crime. With regards to home affairs, it increases by 10.5%, and here the focus remains on digitization and digital identity systems, including funding for the employment of 3,000 ICT qualified youth. In addition, the Border Management Authority receives an extra 990 million over the medium term to help fill some vacant positions. Now, the Commission does commend the modernization focus as critical to addressing some fraud and improving service delivery challenges. With regards to the Office of Chief Justice, it increases by 24.7%. And this is to the allocation towards that is to help enable greater institutional independence and court modernization, which is again in line with some of the concerns that the Commission has had in terms of the efficiency of what's in the country. And then lastly, on the police votes, it received only a 0.4% increase for 26-27 relative to the budget 2025 baseline. And here 1 billion has been allocated through the Kara Fund to help support fight against organized crime, which is welcomed by the Commission. Furthermore, the police will shift 894.2 million within its budget to enhance information and communication technology capacity. Moving on to the next slide, which speaks to direct charges against the National Revenue Fund. Now, what we'd just like to highlight on this slide to the honorable members is with regards to debt servicing costs, which decreased by 3.7% or close to 17 billion relative to the 2025 budget for the same financial year. Now, this reduction suggests that the government efforts to stabilize debt and manage borrowing costs may be yielding modest fiscal relief. That said, debt service costs still cried out productive expenditure, and any fiscal relief must be used to strategically strengthen growth enhancing investments. Moving on to the next slide, which is the Special Appropriation Bill. I think this was well covered by our PPO colleagues, so I'll just move on to the next slide, which highlights the Commission's recommendations with regards to the Appropriation Bill and Special Appropriation Bill. So with regards to the 2026 Special Appropriation Bill, firstly, the Commission recommends that departments align budget submissions more closely with actual expenditure patterns and announced policy reforms. And here we'd like to really recommend that to help ensure accountability, that the Standing and Select Committees on Appropriation exercise their oversight powers to help to summon some of these departments who reflect persistent mismatches between spending performance and baseline revisions to account for these deviations. Secondly, the Commission would like to reiterate its recommendation from the 2025 NTPBS, which recommends that the government's infrastructure prioritization over the medium term be accompanied by robust project delivery across the entire project building lifecycle. And then lastly, the Commission recommends that the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education and Training, in collaboration with the Department of Higher Education and Training, organized labor, employees, and professional bodies, conduct a comprehensive review of the sector education and training authorities to eliminate functional overlaps and duplications and more closely align training with the demands of the economy. With regards to the 2026 Special Appropriation Bill, here the Commission would like to point out that given the fact that PRASA has a history of procurement irregularities and financial mismanagement, the Commission would like to recommend that Parliament, through its Portfolio Committee on Transport, as well as the Standing and Select Committees on Appropriation, exercise rigorous oversight of that 5.8 billion special appropriation and monitor the measurable progress towards increasing annual passenger trips. Thank you, Chair and honorable members. I'll hand over to my next colleague.
Good morning, Chairperson, and good morning to all honorable members and all other colleagues present in the platform. I will take you through the last two sections of our presentation, as the first one relates to the division of revenue as it relates to provinces, followed by the local government issues. Okay, in this slide, what we need to bring to the attention of the honorable members is that in the 2025 budget, the total allocation for provinces for 2026-27 financial year was projected to be 798.4 billion and has been increased by 1.5% in the 2026 budget to 810.5 billion. Key to note here, honorable members, is that the provincial equitable share has been increased from 660.6 billion to 140.2 billion between the two budgets, representing an increase of 1.5%, while constitutional grants on the other side between the two budgets has been increased by 1.7% from 137.7 billion to 140.2 billion. The next slide just shows allocation from the PS by province. And key to note here is that there's been an increase to the allocation for provinces, for all provinces from the PS, and this range from 1.1% to 1.8% for the 2026-27 financial year when you compare the two budgets. And key reasons for such an increase, they include the reasons to support compensation pressures, including equalization of grade R pay in the education sector. Secondly, compensation and employment of doctors, and to cover the shortfall in goods and services expenditure in the health sector. And lastly, to provide for the early retirement program and for the presidential employment stimulus. And key here, honorable members, is just to emphasize the point that these additions that we see added to the provincial equitable share to all provinces are calculated outside of the PS formula. And then this, according to the Commission, is of the view that this undermines the principles of the good IGFR system, like transparency and predictability. And furthermore, it's key to note that about 1.1 billion is allocated in this manner and added to the provincial equitable share formula, which again undermines these key principles. The next slide shows conditional grants, how they've been adjusted. Key to note here is that some of the conditional grants that have been adjusted include the informal settlement upgrading and partnership grant, which has been adjusted by 107%. And the funding mainly comes from the HSDG, Human Scheme Development Grant. Secondly, we've got the Early Childhood Development Grant, which has been adjusted by 115.8% for the expansion of early childhood development services. Thirdly, the other grant, as we can see in this graph, is CASP, Comprehensive Agricultural Support Program, which has been increased by 34.5%. And part of this, honorable members, is to just to indicate that is from the Lima Lizima, which has been merged to this grant, which is we do welcome as a commission. Then of a concern now is a decrease that we see as the HSDG grant has been decreased by 7.5%. As a result, as I've indicated, that some funding from this grant has been shifted to the informal settlements, upgrading and partnership grant. Though we note that the HSDG had its own challenges, but this is a concern for the Commission because we are of the view that it will affect the delivery of human settlements or housing units. The next slide. Next slide just shows the adjustments that have been made to some of these questionnaire grants. As we can see here, we've indicated that the informal settlement upgrading partnership grant has been increased by 107% across all provinces, and mainly the grant has been taken from the HSDG grant. And that grant has been increased from 930 million to 1.9 billion between the two budgets. And then here we are highlighting the fact that the funding has been taken from the HSDG and could impact negatively delivery of housing from that grant. The next slide. The next slide shows early childhood development grant and the education infrastructure grant. Key to note here is that huge increase from the early childhood development grant, which we can see that this has been adjusted significantly. In some provinces like Free State, the grant has been adjusted by 213.6%, while the Commission does welcome the adjustment of this grant because it shows the government commitments towards the early childhood development, but is concerned again with the capacity because these are very, very huge or significant adjustments on the spending side, whether the provinces are ready to absorb and spend this grant. And then on the education infrastructure grant, what we see key to note is that adjustment that we talk about, that development of matching the education infrastructure grant with the school infrastructure backlog grant, which is a development that we do welcome as a commission. But here we are concerned as a commission because at the same time, the merged grant, the EIG, has been reduced by 490 million. And then this is a huge downward adjustment. Next slide. So with respect to provinces, Chair and honorable members, we are putting forward these three following recommendations. Firstly, we noted these significant additions to the provinces that are through the provincial equitable share formula and funding, which is determined outside the formula. The Commission reiterates and continues to warn against the extensive use of additional allocations outside the provincial equitable share formula, as this practice creates some uncertainty and then could lead to fiscal tensions and disputes within the IGFR. The Commission notes the conversion of the school infrastructure backlog grant to education infrastructure grant, but the Commission here notes with concern the downward adjustment, as we've indicated, of this grant, as this could compromise the outputs and objectives of the merged grants. And lastly, the Commission does not support the proposed consultation and the moving of funding, as we've seen, from the HSDG to informal settlement upgrade program, because the current grant framework, as you can go through it, is not even clear what this ISUP is intended to achieve, and there's some duplication in some instances. Then in this current form, then this grant encroaches on constitutionality assigned powers and functions of the municipalities. And here we're talking about issues like zoning and water infrastructure provisions, which are municipal function. And then again, given that this grant, the position here is further informed by the sustained downwards revision of the HSDG over the past 7 years, because this grant has been revised downwards for the past 7 years and is going to be revised downwards going forward through the, as we can see, in the MTF 2026. Moving on to the local government. Next slide. Broadly, what we can highlight from this slide is that there's been a consistent with respect to the share that goes to local government from the national raised revenue, which ranges around 93%, 94%. Then there hasn't been much changes, and this indicates that the national share of national raised revenues is largely maintained despite fiscal constraints. Key to note here, honorable members, with respect to the local government equitable share in crucial grants, is that on both there's been some reduction. For example, the local government equitable share has been reduced by 0.5%, as we can see from the table, while crucial grants have been reduced by 3.7%. Furthermore, for the 2026-27, the local government transfers decreased by 1.5% when comparing the two budgets, 2025 and 2026, for 2026-27 financial year. Next slide summarizes just the categories now, categories of municipalities. And to note here is that category A municipalities experience a marginal rise in allocation of 0.3%, while category B declined by 0.8%, for example. And this indicates the increased fiscal pressures on local municipalities that are more reliant on transfers and have limited own revenue capacity. With respect to category C, to municipalities, the figure shows a moderate reduction of 0.7% in the 2026-27 financial year. The next slide, to local government equitable share allocations by province. As we can see here, is that while the overall national variance is negative 0.5%, provinces with large metros such as Gauteng show stability of 0%, while rural provinces on the other side, which include Limpopo, Eastern Cape, and Northern Cape, experience relatively decline of 0.5% from 0.9% for the Limpopo, 0.8% for Eastern Cape, and 0.8% for the Northern Cape. Then the next slide. Key takeaways from this slide is that the 2026 Division of Revenue Bill reflects a significant restructuring of local government grant framework rather than a broad funding increase. That's the takeaway here. And secondly, the large shift to the urban development financing grant signals a move towards a performance-based And then thirdly, the bulk water and sanitation is strengthened while public transport and some municipal infrastructure allocations are reduced. There's an increase in the municipal INEP and reductions in the ESCOM, and this signals a rebalancing towards the local government implementation. TARS, on the other side, and reprioritization demonstrate that local municipalities or local government infrastructure grants are contributing to overall expenditure restrictions. Last slide. Yes, let's go to the last slide on the recommendations. Okay, yes. Honorable members, the Commission makes 2 recommendations emanating from our analysis. We're saying here, in the light of the Commission's 2025 MTPPS recommendation on performance-based grants for sustained urban development, the Commission recommends that the National Treasury and the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs formally assess the first-year implementation of the performance-based urban development component and its impact on metropolitan infrastructure management, particularly in areas such as water, sanitation, and electricity and waste services, and determine whether measurable improvements in asset management, project execution, and financial sustainability have been realized. And lastly, the Commission recommends a consolidated impact assessment of the cumulative reductions and prioritization across infrastructure grants to determine the full implications for service delivery and infrastructure backlogs in rural and fiscally constrained municipalities. Chairperson, that's the end of our presentation. With your permission, let me hand over to our chairperson for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabelo. That concludes our submission, Honorable Chairperson and members. We also did submit, in addition to the slides, a comprehensive submission, a narrative document, which is more detailed. The members can also read that. I would like to hand over to you, Chairperson, now for further deliberations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbava and the team from the FFC for your thoughtful analysis and insight on the 2026 budget. I'm now going to open the floor for members to engage on the 2 presentations. And members, I'm going to request that as you engage, I request that you become reasonable with time so that each and every member can have their fair chance to can engage on the presentations. I am noting hands, colleagues that wants to engage the presentation. I will start with Honorable Beasley, Honorable Brett, Honorable Mkonto, Honorable Siwisa, Honorable Bateman, Honorable Ryder, Honorable Ndlovu, Honorable Galeka Mazibuko, Honorable Dipuo Ntuli, Honorable Seate, and Honorable Kingsley. Not forgetting the last hand that is from Honorable Sekwati. And then Honorable Macbeth, you will be the last. Honorable Van Rooyen. Any other hand, colleagues, I'm not going to note hands after Honorable Van Rooyen. Honorable Bixley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and your greetings to the PBO, FFC, and your colleagues and everybody else listening. So just a question to both the PBO and the FFC. In terms of TARS, Treasury's identified 12 billion, obviously from, our view and Action SA's point of view, that is incredibly low if one actually looks at the total expenditure. Have either of you given any thought what that figure might actually be? Have you forecasted what that figure might be after year 1, after year 2, after year 3? Because I think it's important we put figures to TARS. And then to the PBO, I just noticed under the SOEs, there was no reference to the road accident fund. Have you taken that into account into your numbers? And then to both organizations, I'm not an economist, but my understanding is much of the forecasts depend on actual economic growth. And in the past, economic growth, we've always been below forecast. What impact have you done a sensitivity analysis as how your forecast might actually differ if the growth forecasts do not actually reach its targets? The FFC talk about a balanced budget. If we miss growth forecasts, by what percentage would that actually be out of the window? Because we're working towards this fiscal anchor, this fiscal consolidation. But if our growth doesn't meet the actual targets, what impact does that actually have? And then in terms of the PBO, I understand what you guys talk about is we need to possibly spend more to get economic growth going. But my concern, having sat on scope, there's just so much corruption and wastages in the actual system. Surely it's futile to actually spend more if that's just going out to the corrupt. It's just like putting water in a leaking bucket. So we're actually not in a position to spend more. I mean, I would love to spend more on various issues, but I mean, to put more money into projects and programs until we can cut out the waste, inefficiencies, and corruptions. My views are we actually, and I'd like to get their thoughts on that. And then in terms of they spoke about the improved rand. They spoke about the improved rand, and some people have been talking about the South African market all-time high. But I'd just like to get African market all-time high. But I'd just like to get their view on how much is that actually pertain to what they call SA Inc. or actually pertain to what they call SA Inc. or how much is it pertaining to global factors? How much is it pertaining to global factors? We got to be careful. We don't pat ourselves on the back when it's actually nothing to do with us, and at the same time things can unwind very quickly. So just their thoughts on that. And then in terms of the FFC, they did speak about the RAF. I'd be interested to know, where did you get your figures from? And because those figures haven't been audited, and if those figures are understated, which my sense they actually are, in terms of both the contingent liability and the real liability that's actually existing now, what impact could that have on the fiscal stability of our country going forward if those figures are seriously understated? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Beasley. Honorable Brits.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, and good morning to everybody on the platform. There are two elephants in the room that we need to address, and I haven't heard anything about it. Now, the first is a new elephant that entered the room over the weekend with the attack on Iran by the USA and Israel. Now, surely that's going to have an impact on our projected fiscal targets, and I'm sure that either the FFC or the PBO will advise us on a later stage what the effect will be on our own 2026-2027 budget. The second elephant in the room relates to unemployment. Now, in order to open up employment opportunities, especially in the private sector, of course, restrictive policies and regulations remain a huge problem, and we are not addressing that. Small and medium businesses are hesitant to employ more people. One of the factors and one of the contributing factors in that regard is the definition of big business as being a business with 50 employees or more. Now, it is high time that we revise those restrictive regulations in order to open up the market. And I think this is of us to create the environment for business to thrive and not to frustrate them. And what's happening now is that labor markets are being frustrated by these regulations. 27, fiscal consolidation as the initiator of the earlier deteriorating services, economic drag, lower we take note of the PBO's opposition to fiscal consolidation, but I haven't heard the PBO's alternative. So far, it's easy to make still under proposals from the PBO in this regard. Then lastly, the increase in the equitable share to provinces remains a concern. Is supporting education and health services. That is the frontline services to a lot of people, and especially in health services in rural problems. For example, I've received a complaint earlier, a resident from Karedo. She can't get blood pressure tablets because the local clinic ran out of it. See the problem, and the two provinces. Lastly, when we the FFC recommendations on issues they will share outside the share form, which caused by these bills. And then on FFC. Thank you, Honourable Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Brits. Let me invite Honourable Mkonto from the EFF.
Thanks, Chair, for the opportunity. Good morning to you, honourable members and our guests. Chair, my first question will be based on the presentation, the part that says the National Treasury holds transfers to municipalities that do not comply, or those that do not have a capacity to comply. So the National Treasury Chair, they don't agree with this. They say no, they are not holding the transfers. There is a way that a strategy that they do. But Chair, if really
let me see the issues of municipalities, Chair, in terms of the budget, because we always advocate for municipalities to have budgets, but one of the issues that are rising is in terms of the spending adequacy of municipalities in terms of the budgets that they are getting, but as well as in terms of the underspending that is continuously being experienced within municipalities. And I'm saying, can't we find a way to balance both the institutional capacitation of municipalities in terms of, firstly, the quality of infrastructure that is actually rolled out, but secondly, in terms of managing infrastructure rollout in municipalities, so that it's not only fiscal that is going to be spent in municipalities, but we do not necessarily get the impact, we don't get the results. Yes, infrastructure is rolled out, but what quality? Because that is important. Otherwise, we continuously spend money that we are not able to realize any impact from our fiscal spending. Secondly, Chair, to go into the PO, that the going beyond the infrastructure funding gap report of DPSA, or Development Bank of South Africa, in 2023, we noted that we need to spend between 4.8 and 6.2 trillion on transport, water and sanitation and basic education, and TVET, including capital and operations and management, in 2022 and to 2030 to close the SDG gap in these sectors. Is the 1.7 trillion allocation in the medium term, 1 trillion in the medium term, adequate relative to the national development plan targets and infrastructure backlogs in water, rail, energy, social infrastructure. And as a DBSA report findings require allocation of spending close to 1 trillion annually and not through MTEF. And while the 2026 budget emphasizes blended finance and triple P reform to accelerate infrastructure investment, what safeguards can the PBO recommend to ensure that infrastructure delays or revenue shortfalls do not ultimately transfer financial risk back to the state through guarantees, minimum revenue undertakings, or even concessions renegotiations, because that would definitely retard progress. On FFC, just to understand as to what is the impact of fiscal consolidation on gross fixed capital formation, which has declined in the past 3 financial years, and is it only structural inefficiencies leading to low real economic growth, or government to support economic growth through increased public investment and supported by reforms to actually shift the needle towards a growth trajectory, as macroeconomic conditions are not sufficient for growth that tackles unemployment and inequality? And will a fiscal consolidatory path that is not anchored on economic growth, inducing measures, yield the required economic and social outcomes, including achieving fiscal sustainability? In terms of the cost of living, in the light of the fiscal risk associated with energy sector support, how does FFC propose balancing ESCOM restructuring, municipal electricity revenue pressures, and tariff affordability to protect both economic competitiveness and welfare of poor and working class households? The last one, Chair. Does the FFC believe that the current debt and deficit targets sufficiently incorporate developmental outcomes such as employment creation, infrastructure expansion, and inequality reduction? And should Parliament consider a broad fiscal anchor that integrates growth and social indicator? Yeah, that would be my last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Sekwati. Honorable Van Rooyen.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Chair.
Pardon me, Chair, because of connectivity, I'm not going to show my face, but I think my voice is identical. It's more of a voice of command.
It's okay, you can proceed, Honorable Van Rooyen.
Maybe let me start by welcoming the 2 presentations. And I really want to emphasize that the 2 institutions must definitely know that we highly appreciate the work that they are doing. While irrespective of some skeptics within our committee, they must know that some of us really appreciate the good work that they are doing in as far as the Constitution enjoins them to execute, you know. So they shouldn't be discouraged by some of the negative comments that we forever receive from some members of this committee. Chair, I want to check, because it's our take as NK Party that the current fiscal framework does not provide any clear plan on how to deal with the triple challenges that are bedeviling our country. In fact, we refer to it as more of a book balancing exercise, which is more cosmetic than addressing the real problems engulfing our country currently. There's no plan on unemployment. There's no plan on how to deal with the inequality or maybe the wealth distribution gap that is very, very high. And of course, there's no clear plan on how to deal with the basic growing the economy. So we want to hear, maybe the institution might be seeing a plan that we don't see. Is there any plan that they have identified out of this outlined fiscal framework, or maybe the budget speech? Because we are struggling to establish one. And as a result, we are not sure if we are on the right path to deal with the real challenges facing our country. But also it will be important to hear their view, because there is an insistence from National Treasury that because of the marginal growth recorded, a growth that is, in our case, truly speaking, not helping in terms of dealing with the cost of living. That is currently a big challenge encountering most of our household. And as you are all aware, the growth is lower, the population is high, is growing. The growth of the economy is slow, is sluggish. And of course, the growth of the population is very high. So there's no way in which we can say that we are progressing, because the root of the matter is that our per capita expenditure continues to be low as a result of the low growth. So obviously, that's very contradictory for us to come and say we have turned the corner. So I want to hear from the two institutions what's their take about this phrasing of turning the corner. Because from where we are, this is a misplaced phrase. We haven't yet reached a critical point where we can say our country now is on a serious trajectory of growing and dealing with its real daily challenges. And the other issue that we want to solicit their take on is the current approach on accommodating the participation of private sector into provision of basic services as enjoined by our constitution. The state is currently through the so-called Operation Vulindlela, which we have termed Operation Vulindlela, is currently obviously bringing on board a lot of private companies to execute on its mandate. Our biggest concern, as much as we are not against the participation of private, we want more of that to develop our country. But our biggest concern is that the current model doesn't provide for capacity building of the state. But also, we are more worried that if the state capacity is not developed, the private sector, because the private sector interest is not provision of basic services, it's profits, it's the bottom line. We can't run away from that. So in the long run, if the capacity of the state is hollowed out of state institutions and entities, the private sector might end up charging more fees on provision of these basic services that need to be provided by the state to our people as enjoined by our constitution. So we are a bit worried, and we want to hear from the two institutions if maybe our worry is a misplaced worry, or maybe they establish that there is adequate insulation on this provision of basic services, but also there is adequate what we call provision for the participation of the private sector to capacitate the state, because the ultimate intention is for the state to have capacity to provide these services as provided for by the law. So the view of the two institutions will be highly appreciated. But also, Chair, on public borrowing, we haven't heard anything said by the two on public borrowing and its impact on the so-called debt stabilization targets, because from where we are seated, we think the current public borrowing model is firstly not transparent, but secondly, as much as it's trying its level best to avoid high interest rate, but the conditions of most of these borrowers are unknown to the public and waste to the public representatives. So we are arguing that we need more transparency, and of course we need more powers as public representatives to hold National Treasury accountable on these public borrowing patterns. But we are worried that if we don't put hold on this trend, obviously the sovereignty of our state might be compromised by some of the conditions, because we don't know these conditions that, of course, are there in as far as these loans and whatever that you acquire, or debts that you acquire from outside is concerned. And on the fuel levy, we are very worried that the impact on the fuel levy seems to be downplayed. And it's very serious. It's worse now because of the geopolitical conditions. We all know the disruptions in the global supply chains network and what this is going to cause to the prices of fuel. So with the current standing, or maybe the current assertion by National Treasury of increasing the fuel levy, we want to hear from the two institutions what are maybe in their take the impact of this fuel levy to various households of this country, especially the poorest of the poor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Van Rooyen. Let me invite Honorable Ntuli.
Thank you very much, Chair. My greetings to you and all my honorable colleagues. I have a question on infrastructure development and state capability, and one recommendation for FFC and the PPO. The FFC notes persistent underspending and weak performance in infrastructure grants. What structural reforms to grant design oversight and technical support would improve delivery outcomes and accelerate infrastructure-led growth? Again, the FFC highlights governance and administrative weaknesses in certain provinces and municipalities. How can fiscal transfers be better linked to governance performance without deepening inequality between well-capacitated and struggling municipalities? And why is the orientation of the FFC on SOEs only focusing on addressing the financial and operational challenges and does not focus on growth enhancing opportunity, as some SOEs are in a growth path? With only 0.3% of contingent liabilities allocated for public-private partnerships, it is the FFC and PPO convinced that in the short and medium term, the government will significantly crowd in private capital for infrastructure development in an impactful manner that improves our infrastructure landscape. I would also like to recommend to the FFC and Parliamentary Budget Office should undertake research and produce a policy or a paper brief on the alignment of industrial policy on our fiscal and monetary policy framework in South Africa. The PPO is to develop a paper on leveraging the financial sector for industrial and public investments. I thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Ntuli. Honorable Gamede.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Chairperson.
Sorry.
Honorable
Gamede and
Madbeck,
after
I said
Clamester?
Honorable Gamede, you will come after him. Honorable Gamede, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chairperson, let me quickly start with the appropriations. Oh, Chairperson, can I start with PPO? Yeah, let me start with PPO, Chairperson. I think, Chairperson, findings consistently show an ongoing tendency for gross fixed capital formation estimates to be too high. To illustrate, in 2024's budget plan was set for an increase of 3%, a significant rise of 7%, however, resulted in only a modest increase of 3%. A 9% reduction in size occurred. It implies that while the budget for 2026 might depend heavily on an optimistic, strong recovery scenario during later periods, this assumption does not seem well supported by present-day economic conditions. There exists an evidence discrepancy in how resources allocated by governments align with their intended purpose for development. Projected reductions in government funding for welfare programs relating to national income will occur. A 2% increase is expected within this range. The target of achieving zero deficit in fiscal year 2028 suggests inadequate growth in the budget to fulfill the redistribution goal outlined in the medium-term development plan. Chairperson, the consolidation paradox. Assuming fiscal austerity aims to boost private sector investment while causing reduction in public employment and deteriorating facilities, when must effort towards sustainable borrowing turn into an impediment that actually consistently hampers economic expansion indefinitely? Comparing human capital versus fiscal ratio reveals that those at the lower end of society bear significant debt while receiving minimal economic benefits. Thus, focusing solely on credit rating without addressing urgent redistribution measures could undermine stability by exacerbating societal unrest and conflict. Chairperson, on the appropriations, Chairperson, balancing urgency with long-term strategy, the bill allocates 8.4 billion rands for expenditure that cannot be reasonably delayed. Under Section 73.2 of the Constitution, including the I'm sorry, Chairperson, including 5.7 billion rands for PRASA's rolling stock. While these are critical infrastructure needs, how does the National Treasury ensure that these urgent special appropriations align with the long-term national development plan and do not inadvertently bypass the standard, more rigorously multi-year budgeting process? Chairperson, the strategic focus on state-owned enterprise stabilization. Let me start from that one. A significant portion of this bill is dedicated to stabilizing or upgrading SOE's assets like Transnet, PRASA, Centex. This reflects a continued fiscal strategy of using special appropriations to address the operational and infrastructure backlogs of key utilities, signaling that their performance remains a high priority for national economic recovery. Tightened financial year modalities. The provision in the bill that expenditure incurred by 31 May 2026 be attributed to 2025-2026 financial year, combined with a very tight deadline for rollover request by 5 June 2026, indicates a strong push for rapid implementation. While this encourages speed, it also places significant administrative pressure on on departments like Transport and Home Affairs to execute large-scale procurement and spending within the narrow window. My last question, Chairperson. Accountability for dual elimination, with 189 million rands allocated to the Department of Communications and Digital Technology for dual elimination, a process linked to the long-delayed digital migration. What specific performance milestone must be met to ensure this is the final appropriation required for this transition? How will the success of this expenditure be measured to prevent it from becoming a recurring emergency cost? Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Gamede. Let me take Honorable Mark back, then Honorable Ngabayomzi will be the last. Honorable Mark.
Thank you, Chairperson, and sorry for the misunderstanding earlier. I just have two questions. The first is on PBO. On page 41, you state, and I quote, economies such as China and South Korea supported strategic infrastructure and state enterprises through performance-linked financing. And I wonder whether the PBO believes that our debt guarantee approach to Transnet is a form of performance-linked financing. And if you don't think that it is, could you please explain to us how performance-linked financing as an approach would look in a South African context? My second question, Chair, is to the FFC. I wonder if spending nearly 6 billion rand on rolling stock fleet renewal is appropriate without requiring cancellation of PRASA's General Overhaul or GO contract, where it claims that it's renewing trains, but clearly it's doing so at highly inflated prices. And would you perhaps go a step further than monitoring PRASA and seeing as the special appropriation is not part of the main budget, perhaps recommend sending the special appropriation bill back while PRASA is still in there? Those are my questions, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ngabayomzi.
Chair, I'm covered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And honorable members, let me outrightly apologize for any inconvenience that might be caused on your side. As we all know that the meeting was set to end at 12 o'clock, but looking at the engagement, it means we might go slightly beyond the 12 o'clock. Kindly, we profusely apologize, colleagues. It was beyond my control. I had to allow all of you to engage on the presentations. Let me start by giving to the PBO to kindly respond to questions that are from honorable members. PBO Siraj.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Thank you, members, for, I think, a very good set of questions. I'm going to start with some of the economics questions, and then I'll pass on to my colleagues to deal with some more of the questions on the grants, the infrastructure, and those related issues, but they also should feel welcome to comment on some of the economics issues. I'm going to start with the question or the comment by Honorable Ryder that our view is one-sided, and just to point out that our job is to provide advice, particularly at this time of the year, on the budget review 2026 and related money bills. And what we've done and what we've included in our presentation very clearly is to go through the different aspects spoken about within the budget review and to respond to them and to provide advice based on these responses. Now, that may come across as one-sided, but I think part of the reason is because so much of the economic approach of the government, particularly the National Treasury, is extremely one-sided and doesn't take into account different macroeconomics perspectives, pluralism in economics, etc. And so I think our advice comes across as one-sided because we're responding to particular points and assumptions and approaches, especially theoretical approaches, outlined that underlie the Budget Review 2026. And we actually clearly state from page 1, drawing on their own analysis, that their current approach, based on this kind of thinking, is unable to actually address the serious socioeconomic problems that South Africa, let alone take us anywhere close to meeting our socioeconomic and constitutional obligations, our socioeconomic rights and constitutional obligations. And so I think that I think that should give members some food for thought when thinking about what is one-sided and what is not. With regard to the issue of this over-indebted person buying a BMW, maybe I should start with telling Honorable Ryder, sorry if I sound facetious, but I drive a 2002 Toyota Runnix, and I have very little debt. But if I were very indebted, and it came to me that my child was 1 week malnourished, and that if they go on for another week being malnourished, that they would then have stunted growth, like over 25% of children in South Africa under 2025, I would go into further debt. So it's not about buying a Mercedes or a BMW or being profligate. It's about thinking about where you are and where your people are and dealing with it. And I think that also then brings me to the comment by Honorable Beasley about spending more because of corruption. I think we need to seriously take corruption and proper governance seriously. We need to plan our spending so that we actually make sure that every cent we spend doesn't go towards wasteful and corrupt purposes. I totally agree with that. And I think the level of corruption in South Africa and many other countries, including South Africa, we look at the indices that come out globally, are a problem. But that shouldn't lead us to nihilism. It shouldn't lead us to basically brush every person working in government, every government department, every nurse, teacher, doctor in this country as being wasteful and corrupt. And to recognize that the state, even when there are huge elements of profligacy within the state, is doing a huge amount, and with the support of government and proper budgeting and resourcing, we can do more. And to some extent, I think why the TAS is showing so little money is because we actually need to spend more on supporting less waste and less corruption, and to get the systems in place and to deal with the corruption. And so we have, and I've been saying this since 2016, it's now 10 years since I joined the PBO, I've been saying it, you actually need to spend money to save money, to stop corruption. You actually have to spend money on lawyers and other experts who can actually create the systems for this. So this idea that we can't spend more because all the money is going to be wasted in corruption, I think we really need to revisit and think about more seriously. And that also brings me to the question then from Honorable Bateman about our assumptions about demand-led growth. And I'm very glad that we're getting these questions, particularly from Honorable Bateman and other members, like Honorable Wakeland as well, and the questions we received in writing. And I'm really sorry that they had never been students in my honors or master's macroeconomics courses, because I think I could have taken the proper time to answer their questions properly. But just in short, I think the main assumption underlying my approach is that you can't have growth, inclusive growth and sustainable growth in a country when you leave out a huge part of your population from that growth. And to think that an economy which is part dependent, that's usually concentrated and has the highest levels of inequality and unemployment in the world, is going to suddenly change tack because you cut spending, because you fiscally consolidate, And the quick answer to the question by Honorable Brits is that the opposite of fiscal consolidation is fiscal stimulus. So if you think you can go to fiscal consolidation and cut spending and grow with leaving all those people out of the equation and grow in an inclusive and sustainable way, it's just not possible. You have to work with your people where they are and not think about the South African population as a skills mismatch and unskilled and unable to do things. Most economies that develop, particularly in the developing world, have started off with from very low skills base, but you actually build the economy. You spend money on farmers, you spend money on producing pipes, taps, access to water, dams, infrastructure. And so in that process, that money then leads to multipliers within the economy. It leads to economies of scale as more and more of your people are drawn into that. And we can also build on the African Free Trade Agreement and other, once we start getting good at producing mass-produced products for the people who are left out of the economy, we can then grow further. So there is a logic to this. The other option is to say, well, we've got these businesses and we need to support them. And if we cut spending, then they will have better sentiment and they will do more of what they're doing. But what I was trying to show with the employment trends and the investment trends graphs is that the kind of economy that we've formed, that I'm saying is part dependent, is based on these huge levels of unemployment and inequality, and we're just going to feed that if we focus only on the supply side. What I'm saying is that we should have targeted interventions to support spending for poor people and people who are vulnerable and bring them into the economy and make them more active. At the same time, targeted spending on the supply side so that they can actually benefit from that increased demand in the economy. So in a nutshell, that is the approach. I think I've taken more than enough time and we've gone over time, so I'm going to pass on to my colleague Nelia, and then Nelia can pass on to Busi and Mukundi. I think there are quite a few questions on particularly linked to infrastructure that Mukundi may want to answer as well. Thank you. Nelia?
So I'll just jump in here. I'd spoken to Nelia and she's doesn't have anything to add at this point. But what I wanted to start with, really honorable members, thank you for those questions again. I think the first thing is South Africa is not as poor as we think. In 2018, the IMF produced what is called a comprehensive public service balance sheet data. And the intention of this PSBS was basically to say that we need to bring together all the accumulated assets and liabilities that governments control, including public corporations, natural resources, and pension liabilities. And what they were saying here is that this is important to take into account when we think about the state, what the state owns and owes, offering a broader fiscal picture beyond debts and deficits. And I think this IMF tool is particularly interesting, and South Africa was one of the 37 countries featured, and what it showed is that actually when you take into account the full public balance sheet, we are not as poor as we think we are. And I think this is important for members, and maybe a discussion that should be had really about how we can utilize the broader balance sheets to think about alternatives to funding, to think about how to adequately allocate resources for our development. And I think also what I want to highlight is that a lot is spoken about crowding out private sector, but not enough is discussed about crowding in private sector. In the past, the National Treasury used to publish what the assumptions were about the fiscal multipliers of government spending. In recent times, we haven't seen an official paper from the National Treasury. However, in the past budgets, the ministers have said that our fiscal multipliers are close to zero. This is very different from what UNCTAD says. So in 2019, UNCTAD estimates that the fiscal multiplier in South Africa is 1.47. So that means that for whatever money we're spending in the economy from a government side, it's actually bearing returns. And so when we think about this, then we think differently about how we allocate expenditure. And as Siraj has already indicated, targeted expenditure can really boost economic growth in our economy, as fiscal multipliers, of course, are linked to the growth factor. I think in terms of the question about the graphic that shows fiscal consolidation was really to say that more of the same won't yield different results, right? So since 1994, if we start with the RDP program, the GEAR and subsequent strategies, a lot of them have focused on the supply side of the economy, right? And also have really focused or policy has focused on restraint, expenditure restraint. And I say this because Neti Chenge, who's some of you might know him, who is the former head of communications, indicated that because South Africa felt that we were experiencing, high debt, high interest rates, and so forth, what we can categorize the 90s policies in South Africa are really a self-imposed structural adjustment program, which is similar in a way to what we're experiencing now, right? The structural adjustment program includes a lot of fiscal consolidation, a lot of emphasis of enabling the private sector. But at the same time, we've got a wealth of knowledge about what structural adjustment programs did to developing countries in the global South. And this is undisputed evidence, particularly in the 70s and the 80s. So I think what really was trying to emphasize there is that we are in the cycle of a particular policy approach. And the focus on fiscal consolidation is because this is a fiscal framework discussion. And of course, government spending is an important contributor or an important component of the GDP formula itself. And that's why that image is there. The intention is really to say how this can quickly become a vicious cycle that is, in attempts to resolve growth, actually stagnates growth and is repeated over and over again, as we can argue in the South African case, tracking policy from the 90s and what has happened in terms of budgets and so forth. And some people will say we had these great expansionary budgets, but if you think about our last expansionary, or what would be considered largely expansionary, and thinking about just before the World Cup, where was the money going? It was going to stadiums, it was going to the Gautrain, it was going to all this particular infrastructure, which was not necessarily for the masses. And I think that's very important to track where we're saying we were spending more and what we were actually spending more on. And then I think this is my last comment. There were questions about alternatives. In the past, the PBO has highlighted a number of alternatives. For example, in the recent budget, we said, we could have foregone a fuel levy increase and gone with a lower surplus, in terms of the budget, right? So we could have, that 4 billion, we could have really made the choice not to increase the fuel levy. And that was an option. And also, we've put forward a number of other tax proposals about how we can finance our development. And I think, members can engage in our past documents, but to say really, yes, tax is an important factor, but also we need to think, we talk about waste in expenditure, but we also don't talk about waste in some of the incentives that we provide to businesses. So that's foregone revenue. For example, the employment tax incentive, which we've said that it's not yielding the results that were anticipated in terms of employment. So why not give that money to expanded public work programs? We would then be channeling the money into employment programs themselves directly, as opposed to foregoing that revenue to businesses, to the private sector, who would have hired those people anyway. So I'll just stop there in terms of the broad discussion. Thank you. Mukundi?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to cover a few of the questions asked. Yes, indeed. Remember, as a PBO, the budget is quite huge. So when reviewing and preparing for such meetings, we look and sort of decide which issues might be important to highlight. But there are many other issues that we could not sort of highlight in this presentation. With regards to what Honorable Besley was asking with regards to the road accident fund, yes, the road accident fund, it has a huge number of liabilities. If you check the social security fund liabilities in total, they're about 433 billion. And then RAF accounts for 85% of that. So, and it's also, that the provisions also increase as we go towards the MTEF. So it's quite, persistent defeats and arising extra liabilities that are experienced by a certain entity are a matter of concern. That's why, it's quite important that it is also looked upon and then followed up and then proper oversight provided. Yes, with regard to the issue about treasury withholding transfers to some municipality, the National Treasury did indicate that it was because this municipality showed non-compliance to MFMA. It means they were not spending. They were showing a huge number of under expenditure, and they also have governance failures. So there are other mechanisms that government has introduced to be able to address such issues. So even the amendment, the MFMA that they're busy amending, that's going to come out for comments, it also provides more street bench, more power to municipality, to provincial treasuries, to national treasury to be able to come earlier before before municipality reach critical disaster areas, so disaster levels. So those ones, they are mechanisms that national treasury is implementing to be able to assist them. So national treasury can also answer and provide better consent when they come before the committee on that one. Also, with regards to the informal settlement grant, it is a Schedule B grant. It's allocated primarily to metros as well as selected municipalities with approved plans and business plans. And eligibility does depend on capacity, compliance with certain requirements. So you'd find that some municipalities do have issues complying with those compliance issues, as well as what Honorable Suwisa highlighted with regards to the blue drop certification. Well, that is mostly a Department of Water and Sanitation, but fiscal instruments can reinforce compliance, but Treasury supports municipalities through conditional grants and different types of conditional grants. However, the key issue there is that, as reflected in the budget review, that governance and technical capacity, as well as funding, all these three elements need to be in place to be able to deliver better water outcomes. Yes, the slides do show with regards to Honorable Bateman, the issue about ESCOM tariffs. The point was just to highlight what the entity itself was saying. I did mention when I did the presentation that according to ESCOM, this is what they themselves say. They do say that whatever they are unable to recover all the costs. So yes, household and businesses can't currently be able to absorb the increase in tariffs and all those things. So the idea is to highlight these things to members of this committee so that they are aware, so that when these entities come, when national treasury comes, they can ask opposing questions that will enable them to that will enable national treasury as well as the affected ESCOM to be able to come up with better mechanism to drive the economic growth going forward. Yes, I mean, it's all related to the issue around municipal funding models, like I indicated when I did the presentation. As Honorable Ryder did indicate that sometimes national treasury takes the view that if a municipality is performing, they give more resources to it to perform because it is producing. But whereas those ones that are not performing, they reduce those things. But the cost impact thereof is that if an individual in South Africa, you are located or you stay in a poor or rural underperforming municipality, it means that your access to service for yourself is going to be at a way reduced level compared to someone like who stays in a more metropolitan area. So those are some of the policy questions that the review should be able to cover, going forward. Going just quickly, some questions without wasting time. The issue about infrastructure oversight, yes, the trillion rand that is allocated over the midterm is not enough. And you'll find this is not new capital infrastructure. It's mostly rehabilitation, upgrading, and all those type of things. So it's not enough to take us to meet NDP 2030 target. There's just a lot of work that needs to be done, and it is also important that SOEs are being checked to ensure that they don't increase contingency linked to that. Maybe let me just also answer the questions around the about support to what type of blended finance instrument can work. Performance linked infrastructure model, maybe that can be considered. It's where support is tied to, for example, in the case of Transnet, it can be tied to freight volume recovery, maintenance, milestone governance framework, which can sort of limit fiscal exposure. Is essentially what National Treasury is proposing. But what we are saying is that it's important for policymakers to be able to provide oversight into those things and to ensure that spending and plans are implemented as per that plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. I think we'll end there, given the time constraints. And thank you very much for the opportunity to respond to the questions.
Thank you, Siraj. Let me give to Dr. Mbava for the responses. Kindly be as detailed as possible.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair. I'd like to give the opportunity first to commissioners on the platform. I know Commissioner Fowler. He might have some comments, and then the head of research, and then I'll come in. Commissioner Fowler.
We're frozen.
Oh, I was saying I wanted to give the opportunity, Chair, to commissioners on the platform. Commissioner Fowler might be on the platform. In that instance, Chen, can you come in? Then I'll come in as well.
Thank you, Chair. Let me give to
Sorry,
the
Commissioner.
team to oh.
Head, please.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. I was just caught up in something. There were a couple of areas that I did want to comment on, in particular that was raised. Let me turn on my video. Yeah, in particular, around the question of spatial inequality. That spatial inequality is not likely to be addressed substantially by fiscal measures, given that there's been a failure to address the spatial inequality over the last 30 years. So there's a need for more radical measures. The pressure on providing housing for the poor in particular, without looking at housing from the perspective of providing shelter, which addresses the improved quality of life. In other words, addressing the spatial location, which would require purchasing land, which is not the cheapest land, which generally is poorly located, but taking an integrated approach of building on more expensive, well-located land, but is close to employment, trading areas, educational facilities, etc. So in the short term, it's more expensive. In the long term, it's less expensive because the cost for society in terms of transport, etc., getting food, etc., all the things that are necessary for living would be easier if there was better spatial location. So that's the one area. The second area that I wanted to make a comment on was really in relation to the white paper that on local government, which is taking an approach to at reducing the complexity of local government and ensuring and taking the approach of a single tier of local government, combined with an asymmetrical approach to various types of local government, whether it be tertiary, metro, small, mainly rural municipalities. And one of the key challenges that faces municipalities with regard to infrastructure, and in particular rural municipalities, is the question of engineering capacity. And that's one of the areas where the white paper is also taking a look at to try to get municipalities to work together to provide infrastructure. The next area that I wanted to address was really around the question that was raised about credit rating versus addressing inequality. The challenge is that we don't live in a society that is now, let me say it, that we live in a society, in a capitalist society, where borrowing, etc., is determined by your credit rating. And as a consequence, if you don't focus on credit rating, borrowing goes up, and the cost of providing services to the poor in particular would also go up. So it's not that credit rating is the end all. It's really one of the mechanisms that you have to address in addressing access to funding to ensure that you do address the inequality that comes from our society, our history of our society. The last area was really around the alignment of industrial and fiscal direction, and we take the point that it's an important area that we should look at. So those would be areas that I'd want to look at and discuss, Honourable Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Fowler. Chen?
Through the chair, I'll let the team to take on the technical sense.
Okay. Tim?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, honourable members, for the questions. I will attempt to answer as many as I can from the macroeconomic framework, also keeping time in mind. With regards to the TARS question and the 12 billion identified and whether or not FFC has forecasted what this figure might be in terms of savings, the FFC hasn't conducted such a forecast analysis. What is important to note here is that the TARS process depends largely on the efficacy of current and historical spending reviews. And this is included and stated in the budget reform in terms of the technical guidelines on the MTEF for the 2026 released last year. So it would have to include an analysis of how effective past spending reviews have been, since that is a major component of how effective the TARS program itself will be. So it would include some further investigation and collecting historical data, and also investigating the impact of specific programs, and identifying those programs and how they can be improved, or whether allocations can be reduced without impacting policy objectives. In terms of, there was a question on the macroeconomic environment and how much of this can be attributed not necessarily to domestic improvements, but global dynamics. And this is an important consideration because, as we know, and has been highlighted by members, the global economic environment is volatile, and that has recently increased. Correctly pointed out that apologies with respect to the recent conflict with Iran and US. So while we have relatively there's global instability, South Africa's macroeconomic environment does appear more stable and more favorable in that respect. We can't exclude the fact that low inflation has undoubtedly improved our macroeconomic environment, along with lower interest rates. So this point must be remembered. But the point that the honourable member made in terms of how well are we actually doing domestically, this is aligned with why the FFC expresses a cautious view towards growth projections, because the data shows that growth doesn't appear to be attributed to increased domestic productivity or increased production. So relatively, we might look better off given global volatility. There was a question about how do we coincide fiscal consolidation with the need for gross fixed capital formation. And here, just to highlight that the FFC as analysis does support the need for greater capital investment in the economy. So I think here it is important to note that in terms of fiscal consolidation, the FFC holds the view that when considering the scope of consolidation, the focus should really be placed on reducing expenditure in areas that have not yielded effective results, that have not been productive, and that have, in many cases, been wasteful. So in terms of the FFC submission and how it views fiscal consolidation, it entails reducing allocations, or in some cases, even eliminating spending to programs that essentially aren't performing in terms of their mandate and purpose. So here, this is an example of how consolidation can be targeted in a manner that creates an opportunity to bring expenditure in line with revenue, as the analysis showed, but at the same time not neglect critical expenditure that would undermine service delivery investments and productive investments in the economy. I'll stop there, members, and with your permission, Chair, hand over to my other colleagues for further inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gianna. Thank you very much, members. So I'll tackle two questions with respect to the questions that were asked. And the first one relates to what point do guarantees, become a direct fiscal cost? So we see that they become a fiscal cost when actually the debtor fails to pay their obligation. So meaning that in this case, if Transnet fails to meet their obligation, then it will become a direct cost for the fiscals. So what we see is that we need to look at further on that question. We need to look at the framework that we use to issue and manage our guarantees, because the question also went to the point that do we now need ceilings to cap the increasing guarantees that result in contingent liabilities increasing. So the answer to that becomes a yes. If we look at the framework that we use to issue and manage guarantees, then we can be able to implement or introduce ceilings that will cap the increasing guarantees that result in liabilities that threaten fiscal sustainability. And I believe that members should look forward to our 2027-28 division. Submission for the Division of Revenue, which will have a chapter looking at the implications of guarantees on fiscal sustainability. That will be a very important chapter that we should look at. The second question is on the PP framework, looking at private capital for infrastructure development. And I believe that on our submission, we did highlight that the 0.3 is an exposure, and there was also it was a decline from the previous financial year, which we saw that there was an 1.1 billion rand decline because of the early termination of projects. So what we see is that the PP framework in the country actually faces a lot of challenges with regards to project management. With projects often suffering from poor feasibility studies, insufficient technical expertise, and also some of them weak oversight. So overall, we see that there is some flawedness in terms of the sustainability of this project. And what is key to note before we get to the ability to acquire private capital for infrastructure development is that private investors are more risk averse and often reluctant to engage in early high-risk stages of any infrastructure project without strong government backing or also historical success of those projects. So what we see is that it will be difficult to acquire private capital if we continue terminating projects in early phases due to failure because of poor feasibility studies, insufficiency. It will be difficult for us to obtain that. So those are the only two questions I will answer, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Fabrice to answer some of the questions.
Thanks, Chair. I'll respond to the questions, particularly relating to the special appropriation bill that was raised by the members. So firstly, on the special appropriation related to the communications and digital technologies vote. So the honorable member asked in terms of what milestone would they need to be to ensure that it's the final appropriation with regards to this. So on this, to prevent any further appropriations for Syntex due illumination costs, I think the members would need to see the full and irreversible completion of analog switch off nationwide, supported by verified migration of all qualifying households to digital broadcasting, to avoid any pressure to continue with the dual transmission. In addition, Syntex financial sustainability should be stabilized through, for example, maybe binding repayment agreements with broadcasters, particularly the SABC, as well as the implementation of a cost-effective tariff framework that helps to prevent reoccurring revenue shortfalls. On the second question that was raised by Honorable Burke, I think in relation to process special appropriation. So I think it is very concerning those recent allegations that have been reported around the GO train refurbishment contracts, and they, of course, should be fully investigated. And I think in light of that, it does further strengthen the case for rigorous parliamentary oversight over process special appropriation, So while the Commission does, of course, support the push for full transparency with regard to any allocations or any contracts awarded to SOEs, I think while members think about whether it's the special appropriation should be adopted or rejected, particularly I think in this example in relation to PROSA, I think it's also worth bearing in mind what the implications would be of, let's say, rejecting the bill. So we know right now, as part of the special appropriation, it is to meet the contractual obligations of the Gibela contract. So I think members should, when debating this, it would be important to keep in mind that any breach of this contract could result in costly litigation, perhaps, and delay the entire fleet renewal program, and of course, ultimately harm the commuter rail recovery. So that's why the Commission is saying that the standing and select committees on appropriation need to have robust oversight over this, including regular reporting, procurement transparency, and measurable performance targets, such as those increased passenger volumes, while allowing the investigations to proceed with due process. So I think that would go about, this approach would go about protecting both accountability and service delivery. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to any of my other colleagues if they have any further inputs.
Colleagues, I'm going to request that we try to summarize and wrap up really the time.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you so much.
You may continue.
Thank you so much, Chair. Any other questions, Chair, that we might have not answered thoroughly? We will send those in writing. We are mindful of the time as well. I want to hand over back to you, Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, colleagues, honorable members, commissioners from the FFC and the PBO. Let me take this opportunity on behalf of the co-chairpersons of the 4 committees of Parliament to thank both the FFC and the PBO for their comprehensive and independent submissions. Honorable members, today's deliberations have touched on some few issues, including the fiscal framework, the revenue bill, the appropriations bill, and the issues are relating to macroeconomic credibility, the debt sustainability and intergovernmental transfers, and many other issues. And these inputs will really inform our committees as we proceed with the budget processes. I'm not going to waste time, but rather let me remind you, colleagues, that tomorrow's public hearings have been postponed to the 10th of March, which brings us to the end of this meeting. Thank you very much, colleagues. I know we are running, the NA will be running to their sitting as members of the NCOP will be joining the strategic planning. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.
Only the Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.